Welcome to this explainer on the science of negotiation. Forget everything you thought you knew about haggling. For a long time, people just assumed negotiation was this sheer battle of attrition, a mathematical tug of war where the loudest, most aggressive person in the room wins. But modern behavioral science tells us a completely different story. It's actually this brilliant intersection of cognitive psychology, behavioral economics, and tactical empathy. It's really about collaborative problem solving and joint value creation.
So I want to kick things off with a pretty provocative question. Are you losing thousands of dollars, or maybe even damaging your closest relationships, simply because you're falling into the agreement trap? It's a brutal thought, right? We all love to think of ourselves as perfectly rational creatures, but under the intense stress of bargaining, our brains just naturally rely on rapid cognitive shortcuts, what psychologists call System 1 thinking. And these automatic emotional impulses, well, they can cost us dearly if we aren't careful.
Here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, we're covering the psychology of negotiation. Second, mapping the bargaining zone. Then, the power of influence, followed by tactical empathy and execution. And finally, we'll wrap it up with real-world field applications.
All right, diving right into part 1, the psychology of negotiation.
Let's totally bust a myth right off the bat, the idea of homo economicus. That's the classic economic assumption that humans are flawlessly logical agents with perfect self-control. The reality, we're absolutely not. Our actual decisions are heavily swayed by context, emotion, and cognitive shortcuts. The classic two sisters in the orange story illustrates this beautifully. Two sisters are arguing over a single orange. If they use a basic fixed pie distributive mindset, they just cut it in half. 50-50. Sounds fair, right? But it's actually a terrible outcome. Why? Because one sister only needed the juice for a recipe, and the other only needed the peel for baking. By shifting to an integrative mindset, actually exploring underlying interests instead of just digging into fixed positions, they achieve what's called Pareto optimality. One gets 100% of the juice, the other gets 100% of the peel. Joint value is completely maximized.
So what stops us from finding those optimal win-win agreements? Well, our own cognitive traps. First up is the sunk cost fallacy. That's the irrational urge to keep escalating just because of past time or money you've already spent. You basically stay in a bad deal just to justify the effort. Then there's action bias, the impulse to just do something, like making a premature concession purely to relieve the awful tension of silence in the room. And maybe the most dangerous one is present moment bias. Behavioral economists model this with a fancy term called quasi-hyperbolic discounting. But basically, it means that exhausted, anxious negotiators will accept a completely terrible, low-value deal right now just to escape the immediate discomfort of the present moment, rather than holding out for a much better outcome in the future.
Okay, moving on to Section 2, mapping the bargaining zone. Now we get into the structural mechanics of a deal. If you want to avoid those cognitive traps, and especially that dreaded agreement trap, you absolutely have to map out the structural boundaries before you ever step foot in a room. Let's start with the foundational benchmark, your BATNA. That's your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. It's exactly what you'll do if discussions entirely fail. From your BATNA, you figure out your reservation point, your absolute non-negotiable walkaway line. On the complete opposite end is your target point, your highly favorable, ambitious goal. And sandwiched in between is the ZOPA, the zone of possible agreement. The crucial takeaway here is this: if a buyer's maximum budget is strictly lower than a seller's absolute minimum reservation point, there is no ZOPA. It's mathematically impossible. Both parties just need to shake hands and go pursue their BATNAs.
Which brings us to Section 3, the power of influence.
Once the structure is mapped out, we've got to look at the psychology of persuasion. The human brain hates uncertainty, so it leans heavily on subconscious reference points to make decisions. Take a highly precise number, like $349,900. This is a perfect example of the anchoring effect. The very first number introduced in a negotiation heavily shapes all the judgments that follow. But notice the precision of that number. It's not $350,000 flat. It doesn't have trailing zeros. A highly precise number signals to the other person that you've meticulously calculated the exact value of whatever you're discussing. It makes your anchor feel incredibly rigid and actually forces larger concessions. On the flip side, you could use a phantom anchor. That's when you mention an extreme, objective market standard that you aren't actually demanding, but it subconsciously pulls their expectations right in your direction.
Speaking of subconscious influence, you have to hear about this incredible study on Robert Cialdini's principle of reciprocity. Researchers looked at tipping behavior in restaurants. When a waiter gives 1 mint with the check, tips go up 3%. Drop 2 mints, and tips jump 14%. But the last scenario is wild. If the waiter gives 1 mint, turns to walk away, pauses, turns back, and says, "For you nice people, here's an extra mint." Tips skyrocket by a massive 23%. It perfectly proves that reciprocity isn't just about what you give. It's entirely about how personalized and unexpected the gesture is.
Let's jump into Section 4, Tactical Empathy and Execution.
So how do we actually pull this off at the table when the pressure inevitably ramps up? It takes specific conversational mechanics and a serious dose of tactical empathy. The single biggest mistake you can make is a unilateral concession. Just giving something away for free. Never do that. You need to use the if-you-then-we concession architecture. Step 1 is stating the condition. Step 2 is delivering the concession. For example, you say, "If you can finalize the agreement today, then we can prioritize your delivery for next week." You absolutely must maintain this structural discipline. If you flip it and offer the concession first, they're just going to pocket your generous discount and then argue with you about the condition.
Another absolute game changer is the MESO, which stands for Multiple Equivalent Simultaneous Offers. Rather than throwing out a single, rigid, take-it-or-leave-it package, you present 2 or 3 deals that are structurally different but equally valuable to you, like maybe a high price with short payment terms or a slightly lower price but with reduced features. Presenting choices entirely bypasses that stubborn positional posturing. Plus, it cleverly uncovers the other person's hidden priorities based on exactly which package they naturally gravitate toward.
Now, when things get really heated, that's when we deploy tactical empathy. Former FBI hostage negotiator Chris Voss made these techniques super famous. Let's rapid fire through them. Mirroring is simply repeating the last 1 to 3 words of their sentence to get them to elaborate. Labeling is explicitly naming their emotion, saying something like, "It seems like you're under severe pressure," and then letting it sit, with a mandatory 4-second pause. The accusation audit is where you state the absolute worst-case negative things they might be thinking about you before they even have a chance to voice them, which totally neutralizes the sting. And finally, no-oriented questions. Instead of begging for a yes, which feels like a trap to people, ask for a no. Say, "Are you against exploring a new approach?" It gives them this crucial, empowering sense of safety and control.
And here's the secret sauce. All of these verbal moves are amplified by your delivery. Specifically, what's called the late-night FM DJ voice. When tensions peak, you physically drop your chin to your chest, you slow your cadence way down, and you pitch your voice downward. It projects this quiet, absolute authority. It literally lowers the cortisol levels in the room and signals total safety and composure.
Your ultimate goal with all this tactical empathy is to summarize their perspective so perfectly that they look at you and say, "That's right." Notice the critical difference there between "that's right" and "you're right." "You're right" is usually just a passive dismissal. It's a polite way to get you to stop talking. But "that's right"? That signals genuine cognitive alignment. You've reached a shared reality. It is the absolute breakthrough moment in any negotiation.
Wrapping up with Section 5, Real-World Field Applications.
Let's take all this theory out into the wild. How do we apply this cognitive science to salary talks, B2B sales, or even managing conflict in our own living rooms? Well, in B2B sales or workplace salary discussions, relying strictly on positional haggling over a single number, like price, is the worst thing you can do. It destroys value. You have to expand the scope. Introduce multiple variables you can trade across: payment terms, delivery speed, service level agreements, hybrid work flexibility, you name it. Remember those MESOs we talked about? Use them here to build a package deal that gets you what you need without destroying your margins or your professional value. Now, what about the home front, dealing with marital or family conflict? According to Dr. John Gottman's research, almost 2/3 of relationship conflicts are actually perpetual. They just keep coming up. The secret to constructive intimacy is neutralizing what he calls the 4 horsemen: criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewalling. If you want to negotiate household harmony, you gotta use the antidotes. Try a softened startup, using gentle I statements instead of harsh, blaming criticism, or taking self-soothing breaks for 20 minutes when your heart rate spikes and you feel that stonewalling urge kick in.
Which brings us to a wildly practical tool for personal compromise: the compromise bagel. Picture a couple, let's call them Chris and Emily, who are constantly fighting over their chaotic schedules. They sat down and drew 2 circles. The inner circle is super small. These are the absolute non-negotiable needs. For Chris, it was 1 dedicated family night a week. For Emily, it was 3 spin classes for her mental health. Then there's the outer circle, which is large and highly flexible. Book clubs, PTA meetings, which specific days the workouts happen. By keeping their non-negotiable inner circles extremely tight, they could creatively negotiate within that large, flexible outer circle,
They shifted days around, dropped lesser commitments, and created a perfect schedule completely free of resentment.
So, we've walked through the cognitive biases, we mapped the structural boundaries, looked at the incredible power of influence, and unpacked the critical need for tactical empathy. I'll leave you with this final thought. Now that you know the actual behavioral science behind all of this, is your next negotiation going to be a stressful battle of attrition, or is it going to be a masterpiece of joint value creation? The tools are right here, ready to help you claim value and strengthen the relationships that matter most. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.